Hello, everybody. Looks like we are live today. Welcome to Mission Top. As you can see, I am streaming from a different place from where I usually stream. I'm here in the workshop on the farmstead. And as you can see, it's a little bit unkept in here. A lot of dust around here and misplaced things. But I'm streaming here from a reason, and that's because from now on, I want this to be the main place that we stream from. And so we have already cleared out a bunch of stuff that we had in here, and this is going to force me to really get this place looking sharp and make this a nice place to stream. Get us some nice backdrops and things that I think you'll enjoy in the future. But as with most things here at Mission Top, you're going to get to see the process as we kind of build this space out and make it something special. So today we're going to be talking about American pragmatism and pluralism. And on the face of it, you know, maybe that's not the most captivating ideas, because it's not exactly something I would expect everybody to know about, especially relating to the topics that we've covered so far on this stream. But if you're willing to give it a chance and hear out the ideas, I think you'll see that these ideas actually underlie a lot of the things that we've presented. You'll see it definitely in the stream that we did relating Jordan Peterson's latest book to manhood. And there's a reason for that. I think Jordan Peterson was the one that introduced me to this book, or mentioned it as a book that had influenced him. And as I got to reading it, you could see that there were ideas here that have come to underlie his thought. And more than that, I think they're ideas that are relevant to ourselves today. I think they are very useful ideas, and that's the very nature of what pragmatism is. And so I think this is an idea that is worth its time. It's worth giving its due, because it may reshape the very way that you see truth. So the way that I'm going to frame this discussion today is by kind of talking around this book right here, The Metaphysical Club, A Story of Ideas in America by Louis Menand. And the reason I like this book is that the book does what it says it's going to do in the title. It says it's going to tell us a story. And usually things are a lot more understandable when they're framed inside a story. And that's the case even for a philosophical idea like pragmatism. And it turns out that if you understand this story about pragmatism, then especially if you are an American, you will likely have a better understanding of your story as an American, why you think the way you do, and in a way that's different from many Europeans, say, or people from the other part of the globe. And more than that, maybe this story about pragmatism will help you pinpoint troubling perspectives that we're seeing in our country today that don't quite fit well in the broader American story, as well as how we'll talk about how to turn things back, hopefully, to a more desirable next chapter in the American story. So let's dive into it. This story about pragmatism starts out with three men who would come to be titanic American thinkers: William James, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Charles Peirce. And the book also addresses another person that I will just kind of leave out because I didn't think it was as pertinent to this discussion. And what's cool is that these men knew each other and hung out and exchanged ideas primarily in Boston at Harvard. And of course it's going to be Harvard, right? And there at Harvard they had this club called the Metaphysical Club, where they would meet and present ideas to each other. And think how many stories about ideas feature a group just like this. There's the Inklings meeting at Oxford with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield. And you hear talk of Napoleon Hill's mastermind group that he sees so many successful thinkers have participated in. So often you see that when a powerful idea has emerged, and even if it's just attributed to one person, you'll find that really the genesis of that idea came from more of a social process, often from a tight-knit group of brilliant individuals that nonetheless had to kind of work that idea out with each other, oftentimes not even explicitly. So I find that just a little fascinating aside of this whole story. And each of these men developed eventually their own systems of thought and didn't agree about many things. And they each have contributed heavily to different fields, such as psychology with William James, and he also contributed a great deal to philosophy. But, for example, Oliver Wendell Holmes has contributed a lot to law, and all of them have contributed in different ways to education and other fields. But if you zoom out and consider each of their bodies of thought at the same time, even though they had their different focuses, there's an undercurrent which you can find across the whole group that could, in effect, say that they agreed on. And it's that undercurrent that we're going to be talking about. And what these men agreed on was an idea about ideas and truth. We often think of ideas and truth as unchanging, as things that are out there, waiting to be discovered, that they exist independently of us, and that we should strive to bring ourselves in alignment with them. But that's not how these men thought. Instead, they thought of ideas and truths as tools, which work just like tools such as a hammer or a screwdriver, like I have here hanging up on these walls. They saw truths as tools that help us to solve problems, accomplish the things that we want to accomplish, and get by in the world. And when these men asked, why do we think? Why do we have ideas? Their answer was that we think in order to act. That's always framing the way that we think. We think in order to make things better around us, to accomplish things that we think are important. We are beings of action. So the things that form the basis of our thinking, our beliefs, are the things that we've found which produce the best results, ideas that work. They get us what we want. William James had a great phrase for it. He said that they have cash value. They get us pellets, if you want to see it that way, if you think of yourselves as a rat in an experiment. And who doesn't want to think that way, right? Anyway, this applies to all kinds of truth: scientific truths, moral truth, religious truth, common sense truth. Newtonian physics, for example, was a set of tools, right? It's a set of ideas, but it's a set of tools that helped us get to the moon. Believing in Jesus Christ helps many people navigate the difficulties of life. Certain nutritional truths in the form of different kinds of diets help people obtain their weight or health goals. But all these ideas that we would consider truths, really, when you look at them, they're helping people obtain their goals. If we're on that same page so far, then there's some implications that follow from seeing truths, I guess you could say, as tools. And one of these is that these kinds of truths aren't static and unchanging. As long as they work, we keep believing them. But if these truths ever stop working, then we either adapt them to work better, or we abandon them when we find alternate truths that work even better. So take Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics doesn't prove to be very helpful understanding the world of the very small. It helped us get to the moon, but when you start looking at the world of the very small, it's not a very useful tool. So in that case, it's abandoned, and we use quantum physics. When a person's religious beliefs aren't able to address problems that they would expect them to address, or they see their religious institution not helping them improve in the world, make sense of the world, operate effectively in the world, then they might have a crisis of faith and either abandon that or abandon religion altogether, or switch to a new religious framework which looks more promising. It's the same with nutritional truths. One day avoiding fat in people's minds helps them lose weight, and they find that an effective idea, right? But then the next day, a decade later, we find out that avoiding carbs helps you lose the weight, right? So people regularly abandon the ideas that they don't see as helping them to obtain the goals that they want. So that's the first main thing that these men agreed about with regards to truth. The second thing these men agreed about truth was that we couldn't develop truths alone by ourselves. And it was much more through a social process, not an individual one, that these truths are developed. And here's where you can start to see hints of that connection to Jordan Peterson and how we talked about manhood developed, right, through much more process than some individual creation. And it's through these social processes that these truths come to emerge and develop and change over time, because the world's always changing. The universe is always changing. Hence, the need for new and developing tools to address the changing universe. Underlying their thought was a belief that ideas and truth should not become ideologies. And that's another core thing that we're going to be hitting on again throughout this. In their views, absolutes and certainties were responsible for death and suffering, and we'll talk about that as well. At least one of them did believe in ultimate immutable truths that we could arrive at, but he still thought that we got to those truths through a kind of experimental social process like we've been talking about. And those processes only occur over long courses of time before you can even begin to arrive at something that appears to be some universal or immutable truth. So that's a very brief summary of a few of the common ways that these men thought about truth, and this general way of thinking about truth has come to be known as American pragmatism. So the big question is, why should we care about any of this? And that's the question that we should always be asking. What does these ideas, what cash value do they have for us, you could say? So I first ran into these thoughts about truth back in an undergrad philosophy course on William James. And I liked the basic idea about them because I thought that they aligned with how when I really analyze my daily life, it's how I treat truth in my own life and how I see truth being treated in society around me. So like I said, we oftentimes hold out this idea about truth, that we need to stand for truth and I'm in search of truth. Like it's this thing out there that's static, and if you find it, well then you cling to it and you are willing to die for your truth and things like that. And there's some value to those notions, right? But when you really look at how people behave as to their ideas and how to truth and how they treat truths and ideas, you see that it usually falls much more into a pattern like we're talking about today. So in essence, if an idea works well for me, I keep it. As soon as I find a better one, I move on and I abandon the previous idea. I can't tell you how many times that I have done that. And my guess is that if you think about it, the things that you've considered truths throughout your lives at different phases of your life, I'm willing to bet that you have had that same kind of experience with things that you considered truths. But what I like about this theory about truth is that it does give us a standard of value for truth, how to judge truths. And that standard is what works, what works in the course of experience. And of course, we need to add a little common sense to that concept of what works. And that's because something like cocaine, of course, works awfully powerfully right there in that moment, I'm told. But of course, we know that it doesn't work out quite so well in the long run. So what works, our definition when we're saying what works, can't be just what works momentarily for an individual, but it's the things that work for me today, tomorrow and the next day, but not just for me, but for my family and for my community and for, the rest of the world simultaneously. It's those things that work again and again, not just today, but tomorrow and into the foreseeable future, that are really the things that we should consider truths under this definition. And what the developmental psychologist Piaget called the equilibrated state, is what he called it. And you'll hear Jordan Peterson very often refer to Piaget and this kind of state. And once again, if you look at how we treated manhood, that manhood was an idea that every society, when they're faced with this problem, these practical problems to do with men, they come up with this solution that works. And it doesn't just work for the men of the society, but it works for the women, and it works for the elderly, and it works for the children. And so those are the truths that really come to be the ones that matter, the most to our lives, and we can consider the potent truths. But as we're talking about, these things change as well, and so things that work today that we consider truths might not work when they stop working. We have to be willing to abandon them, of course, and figure out, given the new nature of the environment, what will work from there. So the value I find in using this kind of standard of truth is it helps me to feel comfortable with a number of things that I believe that I can't prove through scientific or empirical processes. These days, as I've tried to bring up a lot, we're all materialists today, right? Meaning we're all stuck thinking about everything through a scientific worldview that values things that can be proved, that can be demonstrated in a physical way through replicable empirical experiments. That's why everybody is always trying to justify what they say by citing a study that's recently been done to back it up. If we weren't stuck in a scientific worldview, then it wouldn't make sense for everybody to always be trying to have science behind the ideas that they are espousing. And as I've tried to illustrate many times, I'm no enemy to science. I see the value of the kinds of things science has been able to help us figure out. It's tremendously powerful as a system for ferreting out things that work in the world in ways that other people can then copy. And that's its potency. And of course, it's improved our lives in so many ways. But at the same time, I've also noticed that science isn't yet sophisticated enough to reach solid conclusions and truths in a number of areas. How many times have we seen science reverse itself or make large revisions to areas of thought that seemed fairly settled? I've seen this in areas ranging from our understanding of the universe to nutrition and medicine. And again, I don't fault science for this. If you look at it in this framework, science is just stuck in this same pragmatic process of truth as anything else. That's just how the process works and progresses. But what I have a problem with is when people think that science is the only way to reach useful conclusions, or that just because a scientific study released today reaches a certain conclusion, that this settles, truth for all time in an area. And yet we behave oftentimes as if it does. That's the thing, that when people are trying to get science behind their ideas, they're trying to act like they've settled on the truth because science said it. But of course, we should never treat it like that, because we know that science itself changes. And there's also many areas of science that just have not yet been able to capture the complexity of reality enough to even really say nearly anything that's finally conclusive. To me, it seems like the area in which science seems most unsettled are the disciplines that deal with human beings. And that's pretty understandable to reach if you consider that for science to reach a solid conclusion, in an experiment or something, all the other variables other than the one that's being studied have to be isolated ultimately, or they have to attempt to be isolated. And so human beings are so complex that it is incredibly difficult to isolate all the variables and just know that you're just focusing on this one variable that you're doing the experiment on. That's why there's all this talk about, science can oftentimes find a lot of correlations in data, but it's very hard to prove causation, that it was just one specific thing that that you can trace and prove that this was the thing that caused the difference in the experiment. So I'm kind of talking abstractly, so maybe it'd be useful to use an example, and that would be nutritional studies. I mean, you think about what science has to do to make a final conclusion about what is actually the most nutritious, or what is causing obesity in a population. Is it sugar? Is it carbs? Is it fat? They varied over all of those, and it's because it's so difficult to actually study it. Because in order to study it, you'd have to get this fairly big population of people, anywhere from 50 to 100 people or something, and you'd have to get them to live almost the exact same lives, across all of their lives, except for this one thing where they vary what they eat, and so good luck trying to get people to do that in ways that you can prove that it was this thing they ate, it was the fat, it was the sugar, it was this that made all the difference, and not all the other infinite factors that it could have been, their lifestyle, their genetics, these other things. And so, science, of course, has tools to try to isolate all those variables. But when it comes down to human beings, you just can't do it. And you'd also have to do it for decades, because with nutrition, you kind of need the long-term perspective. So again, good luck to get people to stay in an experiment in a setting like that, where you could analyze them for decades like that. So it's just useful for us to see science, its power, but it's also its limitations, and how it very much fits into an idea like this pragmatic version of truth, where science, just like anything else, has to go plodding along, finding ideas that work, or at least as work as they can, and then we consider those truths as far as they go, but then we have to be willing to realize that that's not the final word, and we're always plodding on, trying to find even better truths as we go along. All right, I'm glad some of you are participating in the chat so far. I'm going to take a little break and just see what's being talked about in there. And those of you that have never participated in the chat, feel free to dive in. You don't have to, but you're always welcome to. And I'll try to make these little pauses within these live streams to kind of see what's being said. It can help kind of direct me down what you're most interested in, and maybe I can try to hit questions that you might have if I'm able to answer them. So looks like Wiss is in there. Good to see you there again, the superior man. Let's see what you guys have been talking about. Yeah, Wiss, who is, I understand it, not here in the United States. If there's one thing Americans are, is action-oriented indeed, or at least they were. Yeah, good point. All right, some good top comments on science. Yeah, and Wiss brings up, it's funny because some people believe more anecdotal evidence, he says, than studies. And we've kind of learned a little bit. I think, for example, in the area of nutrition, we know we've learned so many times that science or the officials can kind of change their views on things, that I think now people have learned not to trust the latest scientific studies in this. And so people just have to go off of their anecdotal experience, and that's why you see everybody trying out all these different diets, jumping into different things, different approaches. Many of them oftentimes don't carry them on more than a short period, and so it's a messy world where people mostly have to just rely on what they observe in themselves and their friends, what works for people around them, and things like that. So it's a very good example space for what we're talking about today. Another example that comes to mind is parenting. The parenting methods I believe in, the parenting truths, you could say, since we're talking about truths I rely on, are far more based on what I found to work, on common sense and experience. And what I have seen, in this cauldron of experience, based off of my observations, thinking about it, borrowing principles from other ways of life, etc. And my truths are far more based on that than they are based on what I've learned from scientific studies about parenting. And of course, yes, when I come across an article that talks about some recent study that offers some conclusion about raising children, I'll pay attention and give it its fair due. But usually it's the case that I'm showing my wife some study that has come out which just validates something which we were already doing and in a sense already have known for years. And I'm sure you guys have seen scientific studies like that come out where you're like, yeah, that's common sense. Everybody knows that already. And it's still worth proving them, through science if they can. But that's often the case, I think, with a lot of people. The other salient example of this whole kind of domain is that, of course, of religion. And it's really, I think it's more than ever important for us to bring religion into this kind of version of truth, or ideas about this kind of version of pragmatic truth, because it can explain so much, and it can give a way to kind of allow these two worlds of science and religion to coexist without the battles that we've seen from them in recent years. And as many of you already know, I'm a religious person, and I live within a particular religious system, or you could say a particular religious framework or story that tries to make sense of the world. And the pragmatic theory of truth helped me to get clear, why it is that I adhere to this particular story and not to others. And you guessed it, it's because it's worked. It's worked for me. It's helped my life and the life of my family to go well. It's helped us to make sense of what's going on around us and navigate existence successfully despite the inevitable difficulties of life. And yes, I see other systems around me that also work fairly good or very good. And I'm the kind of person, I'm always looking from ideas from other systems or other traditions that give me insight into helping me live a more meaningful life. But as far as other complete systems, I've found that mine is, from my observation, as good or as better as any of the others that I'm seeing. And so I don't feel a need to abandon my system, my tradition, especially because it's so bound up with a tradition of family and family members' things, and go to another system. I wouldn't do that, especially if there was a chance of just updating my own system. But if I saw a system out there, a story that people were living in, and it was just working far, far better than was my religious framework, then you bet I would be curious and checking out that other system out. And if I was ultimately convinced, yeah, you bet I would be looking at it and considering changing my framework and my life to fit in more into that story than the one that I'm living out. So the main point I've been trying to make here for the last several minutes is that this pragmatic theory of truth is a powerful way of helping us to understand why we believe what we do. And that there are good reasons for believing that that there are many things, such as many religious kinds of truths that just can't be submitted to scientific processes yet. I mean, so many of the religious kind of assertions, they're just impossible now to even prove. They've happened, there are facts that are asserted about the past, and that past is just not accessible. No matter how much archaeology and tools that were done, they'll remain unprovable either way, right? But what you can do with any religious facts, the different kind of, I wouldn't say facts because it's a whole different type of knowledge, is you can test them out with religions. You can experience them. They're more in the nature of processes, procedural knowledge, as John Vervaeke says, and participation, participatory knowledge, you say. And those things you can try out. You can prove either way, at least in your own life, whether they work or not. Okay, moving on. There's still a couple more things that I also learned from this book. And that is that if you submit the pragmatic theory of truth to its own standard, you can ask, why did this theory arise and catch on? Why did it start to work at the time that it did in the latter part of the 1800s? What cash value did it have for society then? And does it have any cash value to offer society today? And I think there's actually a good answer to that the book suggests, and I agree. And that it's no coincidence that these thinkers developed these ideas about truth shortly after the Civil War. So that's when they all lived, was that they were young men about the age of being able to participate in the Civil War, although only one did, and that was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And so it was their experience living through the war and then finishing their studies and trying to make sense of the world after the Civil War that led to these ideas, or at least seem to have done that. And I think most of us tend to think of the Civil War today in pretty simple terms in our minds, the American Civil War. It was a war over the evil of slavery, the good North against the evil South. Good overcame the bad, and the nation progressed. That's the basic story that's come out. But of course, it was more complex than that. And the more I've become familiar with the Civil War history, the more complex the picture becomes. And one part of that complexity is that during and after the war, many people in the North came to have very conflicted feelings about the war. From what I can tell, most people were happy that slavery had ended. But at the end of the day, with over 500,000 soldiers dead, and countless more millions wounded in physical ways, psychological ways, and with the untold suffering that the rest of the population endured, and the treasure expended, and the property destroyed, many people were left questioning what led to this death and violence of countrymen against countrymen. And might there have been a way of avoiding this death and violence while still resolving this conflict that had arisen? And especially in the book, it focuses on the experience of Oliver Wendell Holmes, because he's the one that actually fought in the war, as I said. And he went into the war with a lot of idealism. You could even almost say he was an abolitionist, or he was very much influenced by the ideas of the abolitionists. But through the course of the war, he very much lost that zeal. There were some times where he was wounded, had to come home, and then go back and re-engage in the war. Of course, friends around him were dying. And by the end of the war, he had this very different approach to, that idealism was gone about the war, and it became, the book says, it became something much more about him and with the other soldiers about a survival, but a kind of professional survival. It became about skill. And this also ties into manhood, because these guys that were actually in the thick, having to get into the trenches and stuff, it was a lot harder to maintain those ideals about what they're fighting, and became a lot more about supporting each other with being skilled in battle and being proficient. So not necessarily being good men, you could say, but being good at being a man, being good about being part of their tribal group there, their gang, which was their fighting unit, and in doing deeds for that tight fighting unit. And a good example of that, if you want to see that kind of in a different context, is the series The Pacific. That was kind of the companion series to Band of Brothers, where Band of Brothers kind of pushes a lot on the idealism of the war in a lot of ways. Although it's complex and it's not all about that. But The Pacific really goes into a lot more into this kind of idea, like I said, of young men going in with high ideals about right and wrong into a war, but quickly realizing that it was not the experience that they thought it would be, and it becoming much more about survival and about supporting the other men around them. So that's something interesting. So going back to the Civil War and what we were talking about, one thing that came out from this time in the minds of many Americans, including these thinkers I've been talking about, is that there came out this idea that perhaps it was an adherence to certainties and absolutes that had much to do with why the nation had been driven to violence. The absolute position of the abolitionists, and the absolutist position of the Southerners, the secessionists, who could only see either secession and war or destruction of their very way of life. And so, people like this asked, how could it be a good thing to adhere to certainties if doing so leads to death and destruction? And because America would continue to be what it has been since its very founding, this pluralistic society with all sorts of different religions and interests and backgrounds and regions, then how could we avoid this kind of clash of absolutes from happening again in the same way? And so it's no wonder that these men came to develop an idea in this context and thinking about their experience of the war. They came to develop this idea about truth that led the mind away from fixed ideologies and certainties and instead leads the mind towards seeing truth as a process continually in motion. That no matter how well your truths are working for you today, there might be better, different versions of the truth that will prove more useful tomorrow. And so you can start to see why their ideas caught on when they did. So the question is there still cash value in those ideas for us today, right now, with the very problems that we're seeing around us? And one insight that came out from reading about these men, and to me, was that the lives of these men is that they, and their lives, was that we've actually already got a pretty workable system for allowing a pragmatic process of truth to work itself out at the level of society in this country. And that was, very interesting to me as I kind of looked at that. And I'm talking about our general constitutional framework. So remember that when the Constitution was adopted, in order for it to be accepted, it had to be this workable system for a society that was already pluralistic. Like I said, 13 different colonies, 13 different ways of life. Of course, it had regions. There's some similarities and things, but you had the heavily populated states and the less populated states that had very different interests. You had industrial centers and agricultural ones that proved to have a different way of life. You had slave states and free. You had rich people. You had poor people. You had Puritan traditions up in the north and Quaker traditions in other states, and then various other denominations, and you could go on and on. And so this democratic process that they put forth in the Constitution facilitates the kind of pragmatic process we've been talking about at the level of a society. It doesn't pretend that there's a fixed set of truths that can provide all the answers, and doesn't seek to enshrine a particular ideology into permanent power. Instead, it divides up power into three different centers, three main branches, and a bicameral legislature in the legislative branch. And it also separates powers between powers. The individual states can exercise, between the powers that the individual states can exercise and those that the federal government can exercise. And then it makes it so that the power in each of these different centers turns over regularly at different times and in different ways. So everything isn't turning over at once. And so at the very minimum, every 2 years allows for different chunks of the power to be offered up for grabs to whomever is espousing the most attractive truths, the ones that have the most potential for cash value, you could say. And if the truth that some group is espousing are working particularly well, then that group usually keeps their power and gains more. And when their ideas aren't working well and things aren't going well, then they're voted out over time. So ideas that continue to prove their utility over large amounts of time, such as the market economy, for all of its flaws, it's worked out better than all the other problematic systems, right? And so those kind of things stay enshrined in the law over time, albeit with modifications to fit the changes of society. And experiments in ideas that don't go so well, like prohibition, for example, in the United States, even once they're enacted, they can be undone. And so that leads perhaps to the most pragmatic feature of the Constitution of all, and that is that any part of it can be changed. It can be amended when the overwhelming balance of society thinks a new idea will work better, which does occur from time to time. I mean, it's happened I've lost count. It's there in the high 20s. And the Constitution has indeed been changed in significant ways. And impressively, and this is something that needs to be said over and over today, the changes that have been made to the Constitution have largely centered around expanding the amount of people who participate in this pragmatic process. It's gotten better over time, and that was the idea, that it could work even better over time. Even when the Constitution was enacted, it already allowed for more people to participate in government than it had ever done so. Remember that at the time of the founding, the world was still the world of kings and emperors and sultans and chieftains. And then over the course of time, the Constitution involved more and more people in this pragmatic process, like I just said. At first, only the landholding white men were allowed to participate. Then all the white men were allowed to participate. Then all men, and then women, right? Then everyone down to 18 years old, because they started making even 18-year-olds go off to war. So if you think about it, the very nature of this basic democratic process set forth in the Constitution assumes that things change, and assumes a pluralistic society of competing versions of the truth, and gives a workable way for the pluralistic, changing society to govern itself. Today, someone may have power in some parts of the government that you don't like, and who espouses truths you don't think work, but tomorrow it could be you in power, able to try out your own version of the truth. And so despite all the clamoring and the complaints and things about the system today, when you look at it in the bigger picture, it's worked out fairly well, in my opinion. The only times it hasn't worked out is when people were insistent on maintaining their certainties and ideologies in permanent power, and weren't willing to participate in the process otherwise, as happened to bring about the Civil War. And yes, this system requires patience, especially for those that feel like it's still not serving them in the ways that it should. And if your ideas are not the ones that are currently in power, but that basically becomes the price that we pay to live in this inevitably pluralistic world that we have today, and not live in a constant state of violence. In different times of the world, societies were sufficiently isolated so that they could base the entirety of their society off just a cohesive group's preferred truths. You see that a lot through history. When societies were more cohesive and centered around, this very unified worldview, it's because they tended to be, fairly isolated from other ones. But of course, that was never the case in the United States, and it's very difficult to imagine that ever being the case again in the way that the world has set it up. We are still living right now in a pluralistic world. All right, let me check what's been going on in the chat. Interesting what you guys have to say. So take a little break here. Good. I like to see you guys talking to each other. That's good. And I'm going to have something to say about maybe some ideas of how we could kind of augment that kind of discussion in the future with some new tools. So I hope to remember to get to that in the end. Oh, you guys are bringing up how, I started this an hour early. That's because it's the daylight savings time was yesterday here in the United States, and I think in the UK and Europe it's in a couple weeks or something like that, and so that probably was a bit confusing as to when things were starting today. So these things that didn't even enter my mind yesterday, even though I was talking to somebody in Germany yesterday, to a brother-in-law, and I should have picked up on that. So. All right, well, let me get to the last points on this. Having said all this about a pragmatic theory of truth, which I find very useful, doesn't that mean that personally, I don't believe in any fundamental truths because that was the case for most of these pragmatic thinkers. They didn't believe that there were any. And the answer for myself is, not necessarily. I don't not necessarily think that there are no fundamental truths. Put it this way: I believe in the Constitution, in a pragmatic process of truth, but I also believe in the American Declaration of Independence, which has there, in the very first lines, some basic, unchanging truths, or things that seem to be asserted in a much more universal, unchanging fashion. So I do believe that most truth advances, that the universe is constantly changing, and we need to adapt and change with it. But I think there's at least some reason to believe, as you observe the natures of truths, I think there's some reason to believe that there is some fundamental nature to reality that doesn't change, and hence some fundamental unchanging truths. And one of these pragmatic thinkers, Charles Peirce, which is kind of the less known thinker, and one who is known as the least well known, the least understandable. His thought was very complex, but perhaps the most deep of these thinkers. So he's kind of an allure to me to maybe hopefully get more into his thought in the future, difficult as it may be. But anyway, he was the one of these three that I highlighted who believed in ultimate truths. But he thought we arrived at them in a societal and an experimental way. He used the example of using a scientific instrument to measure the location of a star. As different people measure the location of a star at different times, they don't get exactly the same results. Instead, they come up with slightly different results. But over time, what inevitably happens is that unless some other factor is interfered in the meantime, you start to notice a pattern in the measurements, right? And that's that they start clustering around a particular result. And with enough measurements, it becomes clearer that the star must be fundamentally located where those measurements are clustering around. So he thought that that's how we arrive at ultimate truths as well, of even the moral nature or any kind of truth. That one was, this example was scientific, but of any kind of truth, because as beings of action, as we discussed, we're constantly living out life and getting results from our actions, short-term results and long-term results. And so you could say that we're constantly, by just the very nature of living, we're constantly producing measurements of reality and the nature of reality. And over time, over eons of time, if enough of us are trying to measure the same thing and we start seeing a pattern of results that begin to cluster around a fixed point, and it only gets more and more clustered around the point over time, then we can agree on the fixed point we've identified as an ultimate truth. And so one of those ultimate truths I think we've been clustering around now for at least the last couple millennia, and in the last couple hundred years we've really started to reach some convergence on it, is the idea that we do find in the Declaration of Independence that there is something in every human worth respecting, right? That we refer to it as so many things. The Logos, it's a spark of divinity, it's the image of God as it's put in the Bible, consciousness, intelligence, reason, logic, the ability to change chaos into order and the unknown into the known. Whatever we call it, it's the thing we see in human beings that we don't see in anything else around us in the universe. We don't see it in rocks, plants, or planets. We see intimations of it, right, in animals, but not even close to the degree in humans. So, we still, just based off of our observations, humans are still the most complex thing in the universe that we observe, as far as I understand. And this idea that there's something worthy of respect in every individual that has to do with a human's ability to think, to imagine potentials, and then to bring them about in reality is a truth that we've put at the center of our society. And is why we say that it's self-evident that every person should be protected in their life and their liberty and their pursuit of happiness, which I would reverse to maybe the pursuit of meaning or the pursuit of the good, or something to that effect, if I could, because I think happiness has gotten to be an unuseful term, I guess you could say. So I do think there are fundamental truths, but we don't come to them easily. And we haven't come to that truth that I was just talking about easily at all. And I'm with Pierce that we only come to these through long societal process that can take millennia or longer. And we're still talking about this particular one. We still don't understand it. We still don't understand our consciousness. And even though it's, the most complex consciousness that we can see around us, we still don't understand it. And we still have these intimations of other consciousnesses around us, perhaps not embodied in the same way that our body is embodied in this kind of body right here, right now, but these other consciousnesses that seem to be out there. So you can see, we have to circle around these things, not just for, a couple years or in a college class, but over the course of millennia, I think, to sometimes try to cluster around and get down to something definite about them. And that's maybe one more thing I'll put in about that, is that kind of helps to understand why the pattern happens where we start to understand ideas first in kind of living them out, then in dramas like stories, then in ritual like religion, and only then do they start to reach the level of philosophical truths that are kind of more articulated, and then finally tested scientifically. You kind of see that process about truth, and it's all part of this process of, the first way that we have intimations about truths. We have to deal in this whole other process, like a religious process, that is not of the same nature as a scientific process, but perhaps has to happen first so that we ultimately know what to try to target our science on, you could say. That's kind of the way I've come to see religion and stories and mythology. It's kind of the ways that these truths start to emerge into articulation, and so that later we can use our other tools on them. All right, bringing this all together, it is the existence of this fundamental truth we've been talking about, this logos that we see in humanity, that I think we should adopt the humility of the pragmatic theory of truth around, at least at the level of our governments and nation, with all this kind of political turmoil that we've been dealing with. For me, I'm very much the kind of person that likes to let people think what they want to, exercise that logos, this spark of divinity in them, that wants to let people adopt what truths that work for them, you could say, and of course limited by letting other people to engage in that same process as well, right? And like I said, in the United States, we do have a fairly workable system for doing that. It's a trade-off system, where it means that sometimes your truths are the ones that get to be tried out, and other times it's other people's truths that are the ones that get to be tried out. But in the end, they go through that machine of the testing ground of experience, you could say, and out comes the results. Do they work or do they not? And of course, it's appropriate that before we ever implement them, because they have real-world consequences, that we debate about them, that we talk about them, and all those things. But at the end of the day, we have to remember, if we can remember this pragmatic theory of truth, we don't get bound up into that game of trying to say, nope, there's only one immutable truth, it's my truth, and then, stick to that and be willing to die for it at the level of government and society and stuff. Because the lesson from this book, the lesson from the American Civil War, is that when people enter into that kind of stance in a pluralistic society, then death and destruction is likely to follow in the hashing out of those truths in ways that, like with the American Civil War, may leave people afterwards saying, man, there might have been a better way to approach this whole thing. So, as you can see why this would be important today. We see that the different groups are going to these polarities, especially. We see it especially on the the typical left hand, right hand kind of political divides, that people are going to the extremes of those divides where they're starting to entrench their ideas of immutable truths that cannot change, that cannot be questioned, and they're basically just not being willing to answer the question, might I be wrong? That's one of those little tidbits of wisdom, that if in any situation, always, at every time, if you can just entertain the thought in your mind, might I be wrong, then things go well. And in a sense, you're living out this theory of pragmatic truth. But it's when, it's even in a marriage or something like that, it's when you're not willing to entertain that simple thought, might I be wrong, that, fighting, violence, death, destruction are usually the end process of that. Okay, that's what I think I had to say about that and this powerful idea, American pragmatism, which I have come to find as, a extremely useful idea, and ones that underlines the way that I see truth and somewhat the nature of reality as well. Because I should have put in, just as a closing thought, that although there do seem to be some unchanging natures of reality, certainly part of reality is changing at all time. And if you think of it in kind of the mythological framework, I guess you could say, that you'll see underlies so much of my thinking, Jordan Peterson's thinking, Jonathan Pageau's thinking. There are these two great forces we always see in the world, right? The masculine and the feminine, right? Heaven and earth. And one of these tends to have a pretty fixed nature. It's like the point, an axis in the world. And that's what temples often are, kind of showing a temple as the axis. But then around that is the other part of the world, right? The other part of reality, which is the ever-changing part of reality, the feminine or earth, right? And so it makes sense that reality itself, if it contains the union of those two things, would always have a fixed part of it and an ever-changing part of it simultaneously. And it's holding those two kinds of things in our mind, both of those realities in the mind at the same time, which I think is the greater understanding of reality, is that they're intertwined, and that's why we always find both at the same time. So I guess I'd leave that as the closing thought. Okay, I'm eager to jump back in to see what else you guys have been talking about. As always, please feel free to leave your questions, any comments you want me to make. And once we get done with this, I'll kind of share my thoughts on how we might have even some more meaningful discussions around these kind of topics, and not just here in these live streams. So, all right. So again, I apologize. Yeah, they were an hour early. So I guess the best thing to do is I am doing these here at 11 a.m., and that's what I'm going to do them as of my time, which is usually called Mountain Time in the United States. It's the corridor of time that includes Montana, Idaho, I think Idaho. Don't quote me on that, but for sure Utah and Colorado and Arizona. And so you can always just type in Google, what time is it in Montana, and I'm going to start these at 11 a.m. My time here in Montana, unless otherwise noted. So the superior man asked that good question: how can we find a good compromise between being closed-minded to what we think is true and open-minded to finding out another version of the truth? And that's where, I think it's totally appropriate to feel strongly that you have found things that do work, and that's the best reason to hold to your truth, is to say, look, I can show you that this works. It's true in this pragmatic sense. But then you simultaneously must always have that humility, and that simple question that I asked, you always have to just be willing to ask that in your mind. But might I be wrong? Or, might the nature of reality, might I be in an environment that, is changing or has changed? And so it's being willing to hold those two kind of things in your mind and never thinking that we've arrived at final truth. Because even with these immutable truths that I'm talking about, that perhaps the universe contains, like I said, we're still in this process of figuring out what those are. So we shouldn't think we know exactly, that we figured out and we can precisely articulate what even the immutable truths are. In fact, we should definitely be thinking the otherwise, that we're not quite there yet. That we may be still hovering around a truth, but we don't have it in its final version. So really, in any case, we should always be willing to just hold to things that have worked so far, but say there's always got to be a better way to articulate this truth, a different way, and always be open to the fact that our environment changes. Our society changes, our environment changes. Things come into our environment that rock them sometimes to the very core. And of course, that's happening today with technology, with the introduction of AI, with things like you saw how the immigration crisis really did this, in Europe a few years back, and now, it's ongoing, right? That changes in political climates can cause influxes of people and things like that, which brings tremendous changes to society and the environment where previous ideas might not work. So that's just, I think, in order to be wise, like all of us probably aspire to, or at least have a friendship level wisdom, a philia sophia, we just have to realize that that's the nature of the world. There are fixed truths out there, but we're also in this environment that is constantly changing. So we should always be humble with our assertions of truth, and always be willing to ask those questions. Might there be a better version of this truth? Might I be wrong, flat out, And Superior Man, he says, okay, embrace the evolution of truth. Yeah, that's very much what I think we should do. And that doesn't mean that we can't also, better the machinery too. So of kind of governmental machinery is what I'm talking about. So here in the United States, just because I'm claiming that our system actually does do a fairly good job at recognizing the pragmatic, nature of truth, and that if we would just recognize that, the whole system would work better, that doesn't mean we can't also improve this system as well. And so one very big suggestion I would have for the American system is that I think we made it too difficult to amend the Constitution. There's a balance there. It shouldn't be too easy to amend, but just the way that things have panned out with the number of states we have, and the way our other political processes have kind of frozen into, the one thing that you kind of wish is that it would be a little bit easier to amend the Constitution today. Because if everybody had within them a recognition that, hey, if things are horrible, we can amend this thing, without it being some titanic, impossible task, then I think people would be more willing to go along with things, even when they don't like, who's particularly in power right now, or how things are going, because there's always a recognition that it can fundamentally change. And if you look at the history of the Constitution, it has. I mean, that's where so often with the woke crowd and things like that, you wish you could sit them down and just have a conversation about where we started with the Constitution, how already for where the world was at the time, even with relation to notions of slavery and things like that, this was better than most anything the world had ever seen, and it only continued to get better from there. And it can continue to get better from here. That's the whole idea about this pragmatic theory of truth. So that's important to add in, is that this doesn't mean we should just accept, like our governmental systems as they are, even if I'm claiming that the American system has some good features to it. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through. Let's see, Wiss just put a logical conversation with emotional people is not often efficient. Yeah, that's true. That's part of the problem, is that the conversation itself has been shut down, right? People aren't willing to have conversation, and they certainly sometimes the ideas of logic and reason are seen as enemies, as part of the patriarchy, and a force into that. And that's where I'd say, that introduces that what they're operating on is more of a feminine way of understanding the world. Not to say that, women are always like that, but as we've talked, inside of each of us is the masculine and the feminine. And that's where I'd say the more we study the feminine, the more you understand its nature, the more you learn there's ways to how would I say it? To calm that nature of the feminine. I mean, this is very much a part of married life. Sometimes your wife will manifest that nature of the feminine, which isn't based in logic, and logic is not the way to handle it either, and reason and being a good, philosopher to your wife, right? Maybe what your wife just wants is for you to, embrace her and tell her, I'm here for you, baby, even if you're like this. And it's funny how things like that can just like change things completely outright if you can kind of understand, the ocean that is the feminine sometimes. So I would put, the woke crowd of today very much into that ocean of the feminine. It is a feminine moment right now in history, as you could say, because it feels like something new is being birthed here, and in that it's bound to be a feminine moment, which means we need to know kind of how the feminine operates and not try to deal with or associate with the feminine, I guess you could say, in a way that's explicitly masculine, right? So that's, I guess, what I'd say to that. All right, the last thing I wanted to bring up as far as community is that over this weekend I have been, managed to get an invite to this new app, Clubhouse, that maybe some of you have noticed being talked about in the media. If not, just Google some articles and you'll find some good explanations about what it is and why it's fairly different in terms of the social media landscape. So over the weekend I've been checking it out a bit. Using it, going into some rooms and whatnot. I've invited my wife to it. But the basic nature of it is that through this app, it makes it very easy for anybody that's on the app to come into a room, essentially, and then have people up on the stage of the room, which are the ones that are allowed to speak, and then the rest of people are in the audience listening. And people from the audience in the app can be brought into... people in the audience can be brought into the stage where they're allowed to speak, but there's moderators who have the power to, if they need to, even mute people, if they're kind of destroying the conversation. And what's been good about the app is that in a way much more so than other social media, it's been successful at having better conversations and kind of laying out a culture and some ground rules where real conversation can happen, as opposed to, kind of the cancel culture things and sabotaging conversation and shutting it down and whatnot. And so I've been, to this point, all I'm ready to say is that I'm exploring that, and I see it as an effective way not to replace like these live streams, but just maybe make like a once a week thing or a way that we could engage in a different way where I could hear your voices and get you kind of in a much more of a conversation kind of way that I would value, rather than just the chat. And it's very cool, again, because I can set out the rules, right? If I invite somebody up the stage, okay, you get 2 minutes to say your piece and whatnot, or ask a question or stuff. And if people abuse things, then boom, they're muted, and you can kind of keep in order, if you will, in the room. But as long as you kind of lay down a culture for what your room is like, then it tends to be the people who kind of fall into that culture. And my hunch is that we could probably maintain a really good culture for the rooms that we do. Wisp brings up it's only on iPhones right now. That is the case. So it's in very much like a beta stage. You can't just get invites into it. I'm going to try to kind of work with my family members and get kind of some surplus invites accumulated, so that, because I can invite a couple people and then they can invite a couple people and stuff. So I'm going to try to make it, kind of strategize to see if we can make it so that I could invite a number of you if you wanted to do this and try it out. But in the meantime, try to get your own invites into the app. All I had to do was ask my brother who's kind of a little bit more, involved in new things like this, to see if he could get one, and lo and behold, he was able to snag one and invite me into it. So you just kind of got to put it out there to your friends and family, and there's most likely maybe somebody that's either in it or knows somebody that's in it that could get you an invite, and then we could all be in there, and then maybe look at having a little bit different way of engaging around Mission Top in that kind of setting. So just wanted to announce that and get you guys thinking about that. Okay, that is all I had for today. Thank you again for being here. I'm going to try tomorrow to have another episode of our Understanding of Manhood series. I think I'm going to try to target this one on the notion of being a big man, and how that's one of those core attributes of manhood that you see across cultures, and explain what I mean by that notion of being a big man. So I'll try to get that done. If I don't, it'll be something different. Keep your eye out. And again, we'll be back 11 a.m. my time tomorrow. Okay, see you later.